but there was no fork tree available, so I built a fork tree with a plaster of Paris, chicken wire, and you name it.
I think I'm seeing some kind of light at the end of the tunnel. There's a bit of link there, in other words.
There is indeed. We're going uphill.
This is what like you get home. That's how you get on. All right.
Lovely.
We should close the door and leave you there. Oh, it goes faster.
Robert, is this a lambeg drum I'm looking at here?
That's a lambeg drum.
No, that's a lambeg. The march between two counties does a playful jig across the floor of the valley below me. In the distant past, this would have been one of the great thoroughfares of Ireland, of enormous strategic importance to invaders and defenders alike, easily made impassable with the help of the great marshes that drained the steep and plentiful drumlins so characteristic of this landscape. In more recent times, the valley floor has been traversed by river and canal, railway, road and more railway. Welcome to the land of the passes in the counties of Down and Armagh. It's a measure of that strategic importance in the dim and distant past that those passes have names associated with the military history of the area. The village of Poyntzpass quite simply takes its name from Lieutenant Charles Poyntz, who commanded the garrison here in the war against Hugh O'Neill in the late 1500s. He was granted some 500 acres in the subsequent plantation and promptly built a little village just to the north of present-day Poyntzpass and called it Acton, after his home in Gloucestershire. Poyntzpass itself was built by a descendant of his, Alexander Thomas Stewart, some 200 years later in the 1790s. The origin of the name Jerretspass, a few miles to the south, is a bit more problematic, a story to be told a bit later on, but there's no doubting the continuing aptness of the pass elements of these place names. Things have always had to pass through here en route to important centres of trade and population. First the road, then the canal, then the railway, linking Newry to Belfast or Armagh to Newry. Forging and maintaining canal channels or railway tracks and tunnels were major engineering enterprises that transformed this landscape and the fortunes of the people who worked on them. The result is a legacy of truly extraordinary engineering achievements which are unsurpassed to this day anywhere in the country. Made even more extraordinary by the fact that nowadays they're practically unknown outside of the area. But rather than go straight to the gatekeepers of that industrial history, I prefer instead to access this landscape through the personal reminiscences of someone who grew up here. Mary Goss is a geographer and a teacher, but as a little girl she would have had a bird's eye view of all that went on below her on the slopes above Jerretspass. How much has changed since you were a small child running around here?
Not an awful lot on the face of it, you know, that you're still able to see more or less what I saw. I think probably the thing that hits me most looking at it is the big fields, you know.
The big fields?
The big fields.
Right.
There's a field or two out there which are massive.
They were tiny patchwork? They
were tiny patchwork fields. Well, some of them weren't that tiny, but from this distance they looked tiny, I suppose.
You didn't have the Enterprise going through your scene either?
No, we didn't. Yeah, the Enterprise is going through. Yeah. The trains, of course, were going through and they had lovely steam and things. I shouldn't say that, of course, since I'm far too young to remember steam trains, but...
well, you remember your daddy describing them to you, put it that way, shall we? Yeah. Yeah, but you have a whole panorama here, and it's quite a dramatic kind of landscape, isn't it? Because you have these quite steep drumlins.
Yeah, they are.
So you grew up here. You spent the first 13 years of your life around here, isn't that the case?
Yeah.
And you obviously formed an attachment to the place.
Very much so.
Strong still today.
Very much so. Yeah, it's absolutely as strong today as it ever was. I haven't been living here for all that time, but we still own a piece of ground here where we are at the minute.
And the old family homestead is just beside us there?
The family homestead is there beside us, absolutely, in ruins at this stage, unfortunately, but hope to some
So
time
when you come back here,
that.
what's the feeling? Is it one of joy or one of sadness?
Oh,
or
just delighted to be here.
Just to be here.
Yeah. And I think our children would be exactly the same, although they don't even live in Ireland anymore. They would come straight here as soon as they can when they arrive home.
So this is the ancestral homeland,
Well,
as it were?
it's so strange, that's what I feel about it anyway.
I understand,
And I think probably above all else it's the view.
Yeah.
If it didn't have the view, maybe I wouldn't have bonded with it so strongly.
But
you
you've
know?
such a variety in your view here, haven't you?
Oh, everything,
You were saying earlier on. Now, there's the strangest looking structure to me anyway.
Yeah.
Which is, it looks like somebody dropped a bridge out of the sky.
Yes.
And it fell accidentally at the top of that field.
Absolutely.
Isn't that the case?
Yes, it's like a massive piece of Lego that got left behind.
Well, explain that to me, please.
Oh, well, that's
How did that end up
it's
there?
very easy to explain that. You can see behind the bridge that there's a fairly flat strip of field with hedges either side.
Yes.
And that is the best clue, really, because the railway came through
was a
there.
railway bridge
the
originally.
Newry Armagh railway came through there.
Right.
And it doesn't look like the space now for it to go under the bridge, but
Well, there isn't, obviously.
there is not. No,
Right.
there's a lot of silting up that's happened over the last.
Has the bridge subsided
50
a bit,
years.
do you think, as well?
Oh, no, not at all. No, the bridge is exactly like it was. And for when I was growing up in those early first few years, I'm not even sure of the date when this happened, but I'm sure some of the railway experts would know. But I was sitting having my breakfast one morning, and had never seen the railway, of course, doing anything other than sit there, although it
Yes.
still looked very like a railway.
There were no trains going through in those days.
No, it was long since closed.
Yeah.
But one morning, sometime when I was 5 or 6 or 7, I'm not sure. Anyway, I was sitting having my breakfast and looking out at the view, as I did every morning, and saw a puff of smoke coming round the corner over there. And this steam train came along and disappeared into the tunnel, and that was the first time I'd ever...
You'd never seen an engine there before?
Ever seen it before, no.
Right.
So I was most excited, of course. My dream was that they would open the railway again at some stage, you know, because it was so exciting.
I see.
And this disappeared off into the tunnel, and I was running round in circles saying, you know, there's a train after coming up the line. Nobody had seen it, only me. So
You began to think you'd seen things?
absolutely, but I could hear it, and I'd never heard
Yeah.
that before, and
Yeah.
there still was wisps of smoke, and there was proof that it had been there.
Well, the track must have been still serviceable, obviously.
It was,
yeah.
but the sad part of the story is that it was going down the tunnel to Lochgilly so that it could reverse back, taking all the line and the sleepers with it.
I see.
So it was the final stage.
It was undoing itself.
It was unzipping itself,
Unzipping
yes.
itself, I understand.
Which was just
Right.
awful, you
Well,
know.
at least you witnessed it, I suppose.
I did. Well,
for
I
once.
saw it arriving. I didn't see it on its way back, lifting all the stuff. I don't know how I missed that, but you know. But I'd been in the tunnel so many times, you know, walking in the tunnel as a child, and because it's so long, it was a fantastic and exciting thing. Maybe not my first visit, but the first visit I remember. I looked into what was the tunnel, but I thought it was a big bridge that had been bricked up, and there was one brick missing.
One brick, a hell of a
That
big
was
brick.
with the other end. No, the other end was the size
The wee
of a
tiny,
brick.
the wee tiny.
The size of a brick. The other end, the light at the other end.
That's all it would have been looked like.
Yeah.
Wee tiny.
A
bit.
brick, yes.
Understand, right? And here, if you look hard enough, you can see what everyone always hopes for: the light at the other end of the tunnel. Like a brick missing from a wall, as Mary put it. That light is exactly 1 mile away, minus a yard. I'll be visiting the Summon Tunnel presently, but first I promised I'd try to get to the bottom of the origin of the name Jerretspass. Surprisingly, very few local people that I've met were confident in putting forward any kind of explanation as to the origin of the name Jerretspass, but the following seems to fit the bill. The ancient Irish name for the place was Tuirashane, and then in Sir William Petty's survey of 1683 it was marked on the map as Lamb's Pass, but with no explanation as to who or what Lamb actually was. Now, in the rebellion of the United Irishmen in 1798, the leader of the forces that crushed the local insurgents was a man called Lieutenant Tuscan, and for a period after that the place was known as Tuscan's Pass. In later years, when the post office was established here, the postmaster's name was Gerald or Gerard. And the story goes that he was related to the leader of the rebellion here locally, who had been executed by the aforementioned Lieutenant Tuscan. As time went on, the place became known as Gerard's Pass, and eventually corrupted into what we now know as Jerretspass. So given all those convolutions, I suppose it's hardly surprising really that local people are reluctant to offer explanations. But here in the churchyard of St Mary's in Drumbanagher, you'll find some evidence to support a good deal of that story.
Certainly the name Gerard appears on several gravestones from the 17 and 1800s, and both Tuscan's Pass and Jerretspass are used as place names. But I stress there are different versions of the story, all vying to be the definitive one. When we come back, it's a long trek across some of those big fields Mary Goss talked about, to get to one of the wonders of our industrial past. The only way nowadays to reach what was once the proudest engineering achievement in the entire country is to traipse across several fields, having first got the farmer's permission of course, until you come to a steep bank, a bit of a stream, and what at first appears to be a fairly modest looking cave at the bottom of a hill, mostly overgrown and certainly not visited on any regular basis. The Lissummon Tunnel once carried the Newry to Armagh Railway, which had ambitions to go all the way to Enniskillen. It was built in the 3 years between 1861 and 1864 by over 1,500 people, many of them specialist tunnellers brought over from England. And it remains today at 1,759 yards, the longest railway tunnel in Ireland. I'm in the company of historian John Campbell, who paints a vivid picture of what it must have been like during the building of this tunnel.
The miners who worked here were paid, I think, 5 to 6 shillings a day.
Which was good wages.
Which was good wages then. You know, I don't know what the equivalent of that would be. And of course, a lot of them would have had money to spend, and they would have gone off on Saturday nights to the local town, to Newry here. And the papers at that time would have been full of stories about riotous behaviour and despicable behaviour by the navvies, as they're referred to, you know.
Isn't it weird? It's almost a reversion of roles. Here these English people coming over to Ireland to dig a tunnel. So this would have been like, I imagine, one of those Wild West towns whenever the cattle drive arrived in the town, or a gold rush or something of that nature, you know.
Yes,
the shanty towns would have sprung.
Well, there would have been... Yes, they had sort of temporary buildings or shacks that the people lived in. They weren't living in very good conditions. In Newry itself now, as I say, the papers would have been full of stories. I remember one particular story about a boy who was called William Watson. He was referred to as Cumberland Bill. And he got a few drinks on a Saturday night. He paraded out into the streets, stripped to the waist, and challenged everybody in Newry to fight with him. So he was up before the magistrates on a number of occasions. One of the magistrates said it would have been much wiser if these people had been paid their wages at the tunnel rather than in the public houses in Newry.
I see, right. I don't think they'd have stayed around the tunnel too much, all the same, with their wages in their pockets.
No, not at all. There wasn't that much. There was actually, I think, at one stage what is referred to as a shebeen. So there were some local entrepreneurs that was catering for their needs, maybe during the week or something like that.
Yeah. I'm assuming as well, John, that the water we see here now isn't a recent arrival. They must have had to work in very, very wet conditions as well.
It was said at the time that they worked, their clothes were saturated with water all the time they were working. The water was pouring down all the time. In fact, there were 1 or 2 lakes above ground before the railway arrived, and they disappeared. So it became almost a natural drainage for the surrounding area.
As soon as you sank those shafts,
that's right.
All
the water was drawn in,
them.
and it formed and would have gone right through here as well.
Right. So it's still a right flow of water.
Still a right flow of water. Surprisingly now, it hasn't done any damage. The tunnel itself is intact. You know,
really?
We've walked through it on a number of occasions, and there's no damage. So it was well built. Right. I brought a group of railwaymen here a few years ago, and they were telling a story about some new fireman who joined the train in Armagh, and he was told it was very steep through the tunnel. So he kept shoveling on the coal. Unfortunately, he hadn't been told that it was all downhill from Armagh. As a result, they had to clear Gorowood station. They couldn't get the train stopped. Stopped when it arrived in Gorowood, you know.
On that occasion, there were no casualties that we're aware of. But the steep gradient which continues on up through the Lissummon Tunnel contributed to a major, now practically forgotten tragedy that must have devastated many families when it occurred.
In June 1889, a Sunday school excursion from Armagh to Warren Point, seats for 800 people, 940 joined the train, and on the steep hill out of Armagh the train stopped, and they decided to split it and take part of it forward. As they were taking the front of it forward, unfortunately they jolted the back, and it went back down the hill and crashed into another train, and there were 80 children killed in it and over 200 injured. Now, although it was, I think it was the Methodist Sunday School excursion, it was all denominations would have joined it, and it was a big day out in Warrenpoint, so an absolute tragedy. And in fact, as a result of that accident, there was new rail legislation introduced about braking on trains, you know. So
Were just too many people in it?
too many people, yeah, it's just overloaded really, you know. The engine stopped before it got 80 children killed on it, yes indeed.
Mary Goss, as we know, as a small child herself, witnessed the unzipping of the railway, as she put it, back in the 60s. But the train had long ceased the run between Newry and Armagh before then. But we did see the Enterprise pass through the valley earlier, en route to Belfast. To get there, it must go through the station at Poyntzpass, where it meets and of course takes precedence over the road-bound traffic. So many things meet here. The railway meets the road, the canal meets the railway, Armagh meets Down, the past meets the present, and I'm meeting Frank Waters, whose local history society have persuaded Northern Ireland Railways to leave them a tangible bit of their history.
So everything that we see here is more or less as it was when it was fully functioning?
Everything exactly as it was, except that it's disconnected now from the system. You know, these would have worked the points and the signals up and down the line, a distance both ways here, and but there was other little devices, you know, bells that rang when the train was coming through. And the wheel here, of course, which for opening the gates.
Yes.
And the gates were, this was automatic, made automatic around, I think about 1997. So that crossing was done away with.
So that's the big wheel over there you're talking about, in other words, right? So that was actually used to manually open those gates.
Oh, that's right, yes. The gates were made, and there was two sets of two gates on each side.
Right.
And occasionally, there were a couple of occasions in the past where the signalman, for whatever reason, didn't open the gates when the train came. The gates were carried off.
Right.
You know, and
you mean the train went right through the gates?
Through the gates, yes, that happened.
It could have been worse, of course. It could have gone.
Well, it could have been, but at that time there would have been a relatively little traffic. You know, it was always a sort of a local joke when the gates were half opened.
Yes.
He was supposed to be half expecting a train. You know.
Yes. So did that happen sometimes? They weren't. I mean, they didn't fully open or they didn't fully close.
Well, this would be it. But that, you see that gate lock. Once the gates once he had them opened, whichever way, he had to pull that lever to keep them from swinging in again, or whatever, you know, to lock them.
Yeah.
At night time here in the past, there were goods trains travelled through the night, and the signalman would have been here on his own, and there would have been always a good fire on here. It would have been there was potential for him to fall asleep, but it was also a gathering place for locals who would have come in here to play poker all night.
I was going to say, you know, because it's an ideal place. You have a wee fire going here.
Fire, yes, and that's it. Plenty of coal.
And you can see around you.
You can see around you, and you know, I think the railway company would have, if they knew of it at all, would certainly have turned a blind eye to it, and that it was at least kept the signalman awake.
Kept him awake. It might have distracted him now and again if he got a good hand, mind you.
But I mean, when a train was leaving Portadown, they had a system of, I don't know, they pushed a sort of a little knob which caused a bell to ring, which would alert him, and he knew it would take 20 minutes or whatever for the train to get this far.
Anyone who's ever had a toy train set will know the irresistible temptation that occurs when an overgrown schoolboy gets the chance to play around in a signal box, especially given the knowledge that the levers are no longer connected. Though quite what Down Main to Down signing means, or North Crossover Road, I haven't a clue. Inevitably, my thoughts run to pulling pints. Frank, though, along more sober lines, knows what one or two of them are actually for.
Up home and outer home would be signals. They would be signals,
right,
and you look down now, you see the signal down there, that red light down there.
Yeah.
That That is a sort of modern, but electric.
These would have been
One
wee
of-
flaps, in other words.
Yes,
these
but one of the
signals.
jobs that the signalman would have had to do in days gone by would be actually fill the oil lamps and walk down the line and actually physically put them into the signals.
I see.
You know,
Right.
but he could work the signals, which caused the arm, you know, the old-fashioned arm, to
Yes,
fall
to
or
fall
rise,
down, right.
and never did it change from green to red or whatever.
I
You know,
see,
and that's
yes.
what these worked on wires. It was wired right along the side of the track.
It's just on the other side of those tracks, almost in County Down, that Frank and I were able to visit the precursor of the railway, the now sadly derelict Newry Canal. Here at Poyntzpass, the canal is at its summit, having risen 78 feet from sea level at Newry. It's downhill in either direction from here. Built between 1733 and 1741, it was the first of its kind, designed originally to carry coal from Coal Island destined for Dublin. At least that was the plan. Unfortunately, the coal mostly ended up travelling in the opposite direction. The canal was ultimately replaced by the railway which ran alongside it, the final and cruel irony being that the canal was used to transport the engine that bit by bit was then assembled just outside Poyntzpass. Thus another engineering first undid itself in the name of progress, enabling the world of commerce to pass through Poyntzpass with as little hindrance as possible. When we return, a couple of other distinguished firsts. The old Poyntzpass National School, built in 1869, is well preserved, despite the fact that it hasn't been a school since 1972. About 17 years before this bell made its first sound, a young man from these parts had already achieved another first. There was a citizen of Poyntzpass who was the very first person ever to achieve a certain distinction. He was Charles Davis Lucas, and he was born in Drummonargle House near Poyntzpass in 1834. 20 years later, he found himself serving on the HMS Hecla in the Baltic Sea during the Crimean War. And on the morning of the 24th of June 1854, the Hecla was attacking the fortress on the island of Bommersund when a Russian shell landed on the deck of the ship. Now, it hadn't exploded, but there was a fuse on it and it was hissing loudly. Of course, everybody's instinct was to immediately dive for cover, all except the cool 20-year-old Mr. Lucas, who lifted the heavy shell, walked it to the side of the ship and threw it overboard. It exploded before it hit the water, causing some damage to the ship, but it did not claim the lives that it undoubtedly would have had it not been for his prompt action. For his bravery and for saving so many lives, Charles Davis Lucas of Poyntzpass got something that nobody else had ever received before him: the Victoria Cross. I've already combed the graveyard of St Mary's Church at Drumbanher, which overlooks the road between Poyntzpass and Jerretspass, in search of clues about the place names here. This church was built in 1859, just a couple of years before work started on the Lasumman Tunnel. Canon Michael Barton had recently retired from here, but very kindly offered to show me around some of the church's more notable features, including some very fine stained glass windows relating to the Brownlow and Close families, landlords here when the church was built. In one of those windows is a depiction which is perhaps somewhat unexpected.
The doggy in the window.
The doggy in the window.
Well,
That's the original doggy in the window.
Well, you can see from the shape of it that it's a hound
Of some sort.
of some sort.
It looks at this distance like a bit of it's got the tail of a greyhound. Would that be fair enough to say? But what's the story that associated with that
Well,
hound?
I get inquiries from people asking, can I see the Master McGrath window?
The Master
The
McGrath.
famous coursing greyhound.
Yes,
Which
yes.
won the Waterloo Cup 3 times.
3 times.
In late 1860s, early 1870s, I think.
Yeah.
And some people insist it's Master McGrath in the middle of the window. But if
It's around the same time, isn't it? I mean, the
well,
church
there's 10 years of a difference.
Yeah.
And I'm led to believe that it could well be part of the Brownlow's coat of arms.
Right.
Now, I haven't checked that. I'm sure it's possible to check it, but then if you find out that it's not Master McGrath, the story disappears. Yeah. The story disappears.
Well, how much do you approve of Master McGrath, a greyhound? You know, being in the middle of a church window.
Well, now I can tell you of 2 church windows with 3 greyhounds on them.
Really,
Yeah.
really. But you know, what connection is there? A connection between Master McGrath and the families who were involved with this church?
As I say, the windows in memory of Elliot Brownlow.
Right.
And the Brownlows, one of the Brownlows owned Master McGrath. The Brownlows of Lurgan.
They owned Master McGrath. Right. That could make sense, you know. The fact that they have such a strong connection to Master McGrath. Here you have the hound in the middle of the window. So what the likelihood is of it?
Well, but if you see, there's a belt round it with a Latin motto on it.
Yes.
And that would suggest it's part of a coat of arms, family coat of arms or something like that.
Well, if you own Master McGrath, you might stick it on your family coat of arms in any case.
Well, yeah, but if your history goes back a lot, you might have had it for a long time.
No, that's very true. No, I do take your point. It'd be a slightly frivolous thing to stick on your coat of arms, really. You know, just put on a stained glass window unless it really meant something.
Never know.
You never know.
There were other beautiful windows and artefacts in the main church building, but in order to see the setting of the next story, about something you definitely wouldn't expect to find in a church, we had to go out to go in again, in order to climb up the belfry tower, up the narrowest, windiest steps I have ever encountered.
You think somebody made that with a corkscrew? That is the tightest spiral staircase I can imagine.
Well, it's very tight.
You literally brushing against the side, but
They are indeed.
it's strange, really, isn't it? I mean, this is all sorts of different kinds of stone. Look at this one here.
Well, this is that's the local granite.
Yes, right.
Found locally in Gorowood, I think.
Right
There.
Right. And then you've the kind of stone that we have in the tunnel up there as well behind it, and your brick as well. And I presume this goes on up to the belfry. That's the smallest bell I've ever seen in a church as well. That's not it.
That's like the one that called the butler.
Yeah. What is that for, seriously, then?
Well, I think that's what it was. Some sort of a signal, maybe from
A signal from
maybe the minister was ready to start the service, or someone told the boy to stop ringing the bell.
I see.
Something like that.
Right.
And the bell, of course, is on up a couple of flights further up there. I don't advise you to try it.
No, I've done enough climbing for once.
I heard a story that during a service one day there was a peal on the bell. The bell sounded, and when they checked it out to find why the bell had sounded in the middle of the service, somebody came up to check it out. They found that the then sexton had a still for making poteen established, and I think he had been testing
his
liquid.
wares.
Yes. he was under the weather and had maybe bumped into the bell or accidentally pulled the rope or something. It wasn't until that happened that they realised he had a still up here.
And apparently, good place to hide a still. You think about it.
The church.
First of all, who's going to get up there?
Well, is that what you call the Holy Spirit? Apparently, the smoke from the still went up the same flue as the boiler gases, and therefore it mingled, and nobody suspected it.
Undetected.
Undetected.
Well, this is the last place in the world you're thinking looking for a potting still, and you think about it.
Dromboliger, the last place in the world for things like this. I don't know about that.
I seem to be always needing to reach for superlatives in these parts. Longest tunnel, first summit level canal, first Victoria Cross. Well, here's another first for you. Anne Ferris, still sprightly in the saddle at the age of 69, is the first lady ever to win the Irish Grand National. Back in 1984 it was, and Anne herself has worked out the maths for me.
You were 44.
Then,
right.
Most jockeys be retiring and hanging up their boots.
I would have thought so.
I had no interest after winning the national.
Because you achieved what you wanted to achieve?
What I wanted to do, and there wasn't much more left. So.
Had you made previous attempts at it, or had you been in the race before?
No. I won the Sweps hurdle in Leopardstown in 1979. It's one of the big handicap hurdles.
Right.
So won it, and I was champion point rider for a lot of years, and 1979 all of Ireland, champion, all of Ireland.
Yeah.
No, I've had a
very good career, very successful
good career,
Wait, were there many women jockeys at the time that when you won that?
When I sort of started, there was only maybe half a dozen lady riders.
In the whole country?
Yeah,
really?
And there was, in the north of Ireland, there was Bunny and Joan Sheehan, was very good, they're both very good riders.
Yes.
And then when we were allowed to ride on the race course proper, there was only sort of me and my sister Rosemary, Ice and another sister, and 2 or 3 girls. What do you call her? Jessica Willis, yes. Jessica Magner now. Right. There wasn't too many of us, you know.
Yeah. When you say allowed to, was there a rule against women before that? Was there?
There was. We weren't allowed to ride on the proper race course. We were allowed to ride in point to points.
Right.
But we weren't allowed to ride. On the proper race.
Which was kind of just discrimination of a sort, was it, do you think? Yeah.
Well, I don't know. I suppose they thought we were stupider. we were the weaker sex.
You were the weaker sex. Well, you demonstrated that. Clearly not to be the case, all right? So when you were racing against male jockeys, obviously.
Yeah.
Right? And how did you find, I mean, were they just as competitive towards you? Or
oh, yeah.
They just wanted to win regardless?
Oh, yeah, they wouldn't let them away with anything like that. I wouldn't let them away with anything anyway.
Yeah. I suspect you wouldn't, all right? Yes. But how was that?
Sort of able to hold me own.
I think so. You need to be.
Oh, you would be, yeah.
Yeah, you need to be, certainly.
You have to be.
But you mentioned your sister there as well,
yeah.
Rosemary.
Rosemary. She lives in Tipperary now.
Yeah.
She was very successful too, point to point and race riding, you know.
Yes.
She won a couple of very big races.
Yeah. Was she in the same race in the Grand National?
She was third in it.
So the two of you dominated that race, really?
Yeah, I was first and she was third.
Right. And you were the only 2 women in the race that stage?
Yeah, that year.
Yes.
So.
I wonder what all these male jockeys must have felt like when they were
in the I think they were used to being Rosemary.
Yeah,
you know, there's them 2 idiots again.
Yeah. I think you showed them a clean pair of heels on that particular occasion. The horse is obviously important. The horse.
Oh yeah.
You had to have the horse.
I had a good little horse. A horse called Benton Boy.
This could not be Benton Boy, of course, nor is this. This is a boy that Anne Ferris thinks has great potential, but only on the flat, I hasten to add. When I come back, fitter and leaner, if I don't have to be put down, that is, I'm going to be needing plenty of energy.
I had an escape hatch. You're only a learner.
I've noticed more than once in my travels that there seems to be a great affinity among drum men, regardless of which tune they march to. A common attachment to the stretched goatskin, whether it be on a boran or a lambeg. And here in Poyntzpass, I found a great example of that. Young Pat Turley here is putting the lambeg drum through its paces. But it's outside the GAA club, you might notice. And that man on the horse is not King Billy, he's Patrick Sarsfield. And the writing on the drum is telling us that it belongs to Poyntzpass AOH. This is a Hibernian lambeg. So long was this drum in hibernation, hidden away in an attic, that nobody connected with the club knew how to restore it, much less play it. Thankfully, help on both fronts was available from the Market Hill Pipe Band, in the shape of Robert McDowell and his son Melvin, who knew a thing or two about drumming and were happy to share that knowledge.
I tell you what, see, for a man that had to be persuaded to start, you couldn't get you stopped at all. You were getting carried away there. Very good. Right. Well done.
I'm in my 89th year, so I suppose it's not too bad if I can make a shape of doing it.
It's not bad, you know. Right. I think when you're 99, you'll be getting very good at it. But just a bit more practice, you know. You can't expect to be brilliant. I thought that was very impressive. I really did.
My good friend Pat Crossan and I was having a drink one night in the local pub, and the crack come round about drums. So I said about listening to my father saying about these drums way back 60, 70 years ago, and they were put up in an old loft in the wee hall in the pass.
Aye.
So we decided we'll have a look at them. And a neighbour fella, Billy Strain, he said to me, I would give Ireland to see them.
Right.
So we set a date tomorrow night to come round, and Pat Crossan got the land of a ladder and went up and handed it down to me. And I thought, it's as black as your boot. What sort of a muck is this?
What did he hand down to you, this?
The drum, yes.
This here?
Aye, but there's no sides or no ropes or no nothing.
Right, okay.
Just this here. And
just
I could see there was writing somewhere on it, but I couldn't make it out. Friends of mine got it sent away and got it refurbished. And made a great job of it and roped it and put sides in it. They're known as heads.
They're those heads, right.
And roped it and made a great job of it.
Robert, is this a lambeg drum I'm looking at here?
That's a lambeg drum.
No, that's a lambeg drum. Yeah. You play that and you're an expert on that. Is this
I'm no expert.
Oh, no, come on, that's not what I heard. But anyway, you've been helpful in getting this back to...
Yes, very helpful.
Very helpful. Do you do the skins then?
No, it's a fella, Tommy Alexander, from Hamilton's Barn, turned the heads for that drum and put them in it, I suppose, Pat, did he?
We did, yes.
Yeah.
So, I mean, did you take to it naturally like a duck to water, or what?
Well, I did and I didn't. I had a rhythm of my own, which was no use, but I listened to the son of Robert's here.
Yes.
And I called him an expert.
Another drum for you now, except that this is a place called Drummondtown, an Irish name meaning Ridge of the Ferry or Foxglove. It's hard to imagine a more beautiful setting for an elegant manor house, and Arthur Innes, who built this part of the building in 1810, must have thought so as well. In earlier centuries it had been a McGuinness stronghold. Nowadays, since 1926, it has been in the hands of the Society of African Missions, who ran a seminary here to train missionary priests for 45 years. Since that time, it has become a residential retreat and conference centre. I said that Arthur Innes built the original part of the building, but the new wing, called St Patrick's, was added in the early 1930s by the then provincial of the Society, Father Maurice Slattery. Over here on the right is the original 19th century mansion built by Arthur Innes, and a kind of ornate style of architecture employed, as you can see. And adjoining it here on the left hand side is the new wing built by Father Slattery in the 1930s with considerably less money, I hasten to add. But he has taken pains to try to copy the original architectural style. Look at the details on the window and above the door. But when it came to copying the interior of the building, then he had a much more difficult task on his hands, as you will see. With the relatively limited resources at his disposal, he had no way, and perhaps no desire, to emulate the spacious and elaborately crafted interiors of the 19th century mansion. The high ceilings with their delicate lacy plasterwork, the gracious drawing rooms overlooking the lake and grounds, the timeless elegance of furniture and fittings denoting the wealth and good taste of previous owners. All of this, as you can see, has been maintained in its original style and pristine state by generations of SMA fathers, to be enjoyed nowadays by visitors who might indulge in the temporary delusion of a plush and elegant lifestyle. Father Slattery's interiors, though bright and airy, are austere in comparison, but then his building was functional. It was a seminary, a theological college, and all of its graduates were destined for Africa. Father Des Corrigan nowadays runs the Drummondtown Centre, but he himself went through the training here.
Along the corridor here there will be about 600 photographs of about 600 men who were prepared for priesthood and ordained from here and went out to Africa.
I'm just looking here, we're now up to the 1950s and so on. I'm just trying to see, which year would you yourself have appeared in one of these photographs, or am I going to see that here at all? No?
I'm a bit younger than that.
So we haven't reached you yet? No. I wasn't suggesting for a moment now that I was expecting to see you in that one.
1967 was the year that I was ordained, and that's
when the priest started having long hair.
That's right. We're somewhere in there.
You were 1967, so that's you there.
That's me.
Yeah, you haven't changed a bit.
Thank you very much, Joe.
Really
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Seriously haven't.
Thank you.
So, and that was only a few years before This was the Stop being a seminary, is that
That's right.
Yeah.
This was the last group that were actually ordained here in 1971. And then after that we moved.
Which is only a small group at that stage.
That was the time when the numbers were beginning to get smaller. That's correct.
Yes.
But now what's happening is we have big numbers being ordained in Africa for the SMA. There's been a huge kind of transition from, if you like, from Europe and from the Western world towards Africa and other parts of the world indeed too. And you notice along here we had big numbers back in the 40s and 50s and 60s. But now we have just as many students around the world, but they're mostly in Africa and India. And
so the SMA fathers in Africa are mostly Africans. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, it's moving in that direction. We would still have quite a big number of Irish and European SMAs there, but they're a bit like myself, getting older, whereas the younger people coming in would be African, from countries like Nigeria and Ghana, Kenya, Tanzania, Zambia, South Africa.
But the African connection is still very, very, very strong.
Very, very strong. Very, very strong.
Yes.
As evidence of the strength of that connection, Father Corrigan then showed me what they have called the African Link, a display of African religious art whose beauty and skill of execution must surely rival the grandeur of the 19th century manor. These carvings and sculptures are entirely African in every aspect, but they're expressions of what Father Corrigan calls the enculturation of the gospel.
And there was an SMA priest called Father Kevin Carroll, and he did a huge amount of work in developing that idea of using a local art form like the carvings to express Christian themes. And here we have an example of it. This is obviously the nativity set. Yes. That was carved in Ikitiland in western Nigeria in the 1950s.
So the wood carving skills and that style was already indigenous in the area?
Oh yes, it was. And up to then they had used it to express their own traditional religion.
These are more traditional kind of wood carvings that we're talking about.
These are actually from Ghana. These two are from Ghana. You have to have a great kind of respect for the people that you go to live with and work with, and in fact we always find that we learn a lot from the people of Africa. We might go out in the beginning thinking we're going out to give a lot and that we have a lot of answers, but when you're there for a while you discover that they have very rich traditions and beliefs, and we can learn a lot from them and from their values, and then I suppose to try to bring together or to marry like some of the values of their cultures and their traditions with the Christian values.
The fusion of different traditions and values expressed in the form of sculpture or carving is something with which Father John Travers would be very familiar. Retired now to Drummondine after years of mission work in Africa, Father Travers is nowhere happier than in his workshop surrounded by little bits of Africa whose innate beauty he delights in releasing.
What would your own favourite wood be to work with?
The colour of mahogany is beautiful, but I love the native. You'll see a bit of native ash over there.
Yeah.
Green is beautiful.
Right.
I think the wood turner works. When you get the shape going, you're now like a painter. You want to expose the little grains, you see.
I see, right.
Yes, when you're making a bowl, you see, you're digging into a big piece of, and you begin to see the beauty of nature.
Yeah.
You know, the sawmill will have it clean.
Yeah.
You start taking a cut and you see the inside of the tree.
Yes.
And it's a wonderful experience.
You think trees were made for that purpose, practically? It sounds like it, doesn't it?
Father Travers has, I think, a slightly unusual background for a missionary priest. During the Second World War, he was an engineer, involved in highly secret work developing and perfecting radiolocation, or radar. After the war, he had what is described as a late vocation and became an SMA father.
I went out to Africa with all my engineering skills, and after a year or so the bishop says, he was a Mayo man, Cripes Travers, he said, this time you built something. And I had never seen concrete mixed, nor plaster.
Really?
Yeah. So I built colleges and hospitals, 2 hospitals, 4 colleges, and half a dozen churches.
Half a dozen churches, right. So you sort of learnt as you went along with it?
I tell you, you had to really bluff, you know.
Well, did they all stay up? None of them fell down? Fingers crossed.
I was back there a couple of years ago just to look around. Yes, they were still there.
And of course, nowadays, wood isn't the only material available to Father Travers. He's one of those people you would describe as having great hands, as well as great originality. And some time ago, he came across a very fine set of Stations of the Cross in Carrara marble, which had been brought over from Milan, but were no longer required by the original owners.
They gave them to us. And when I retired here, I saw them and I thought, why are they in a shed?
Yes.
So I built them in that, you know. The bricklayer story, you see, I thought, a house builder won't. He'll go mad when he sees my plans. And this young fella...
You designed this?
I scraps of paper, you see.
Yes, yes.
And this young fella came up, are you Father Travers? I said, yes. Oh, you know my dad, he said. He lives in Camlock. And of course, I said, oh, yeah, of course I know him. Yeah, what's his name? You see. But I said, what are you doing? I'm working in Australia.
Yes.
What are you doing there? I'm teaching bricklaying.
Get away.
Now that is a coincidence.
So
a million to one.
He was sent to you.
A million to one.
A million to one coincidence. Okay.
And then that's the Roman fort. You see.
I see.
SPQR. Right. Senatus Populusque Romanum. Yes. The Senate and the people of Rome.
Yes.
You'll see that on all the Roman banners.
You do, indeed. Yeah. Yes. I see you have 3 spears as well.
And 3 spears. That's where Pilate washed his hands.
Right.
But somebody nicked the bowl.
There was a bowl there. A wee hole in the wall where it was fixed
it's
in.
Gone. Right. And then that square pillar, you see, that's the Roman power.
Okay. Right.
That's the Hebrew power.
Right.
See the 7 brass candlesticks.
I see.
You see?
Right.
And the Lord is between the two of them.
Between the two of them.
You know?
I see.
And they're fighting over who has jurisdiction over this preaching man, you see.
And, whether for devotional reasons or simply to wonder at the fusion of marble and imagination, there are 13 more stations you can visit in the grounds around Drummondine.